So if you're like me, you get home from a long day of photography and you upload your photos to your computer and you end up getting photos that look like this. It happens to me way too often. So recently I have been doing street photography on a consistent basis. How to up your street photography game in the simplest way possible. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is exposure. The exposure consists of your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. These three things are going to affect the lighting in your picture. I think a great tip for getting your exposure down would be using a setting like shutter priority or aperture priority. In this clip, I'm using shutter priority. If you don't know what shutter priority is when your camera will automatically adjust the aperture to whatever setting you're in right now. So in this case, it'd be pretty dark. So for shutter priority, you manually adjust the shutter speed. You turn the shutter speed down if you need more light. You turn the shutter speed up if you need less. Personally, I don't ever go below around 250 shutter speed. 200 would be pushing it, but for the most part, I try to stay in the 200 to 400 shutter speed range. And also with shutter priority, you adjust the ISO. So in this case, I'm kind of backed out. Under this little marketplace, you have a light bar that's primarily the main light source in this picture. My focal point is that car that's parked out front, trying to get those nice highlights that are reflecting off that car. The first picture I got of this scene was a little overexposed, but I adjusted them, turning my ISO down, I turned my shutter speed up. I managed to get this picture. And then for this next picture, you have the statue of the dog, and then you have like the street lights and the signs, and then you also have the sunset in the background. Shutter priority or aperture priority is good for learning how to correctly manage the amount of exposure your photo gets. So that's basically it for exposure. The next point I want to talk about is filling your frame. So what I like to do to make sure that I'm not leaving excess amount of space or the ground in the foreground, or maybe a little bit too much sky in the background. Most cameras have a setting where you can turn on a grid. I use that. And for the lower third of the grid, a great point where you can put your subject, because that's going to allow for a shorter distance from beneath the lower third to your subject. You're not going to have too much space just sitting there. The higher third is a good place for a horizon line or whatever you have in the background, like a building, just something that fills that space, and it's kind of not really another focal point of the picture, but like a kind of like the environment, I guess you could say. You'd be filling in that higher third of the setting, and then above that it won't leave too much space for the sky, so you won't have the sky taking up half of your photo. So for this example, I'm kind of back on the other side of the street. My main focal point is that LED sign, that Paramount sign that's behind that tree. So in the foreground you have that blurred out car, and then you also have another car that's crossing the street in the lower third. So that's going to kind of fill some space in between my subject and from where I'm taking the picture. It's not going to allow for all that empty space. And then in that higher third, you have that tree line, and then it gets dark up in the higher third. Top 50% of the photo isn't just dark. And then the third and the final thing that I want to go over in this video is you control the camera, so perspective. So perspective is kind of the independent variable, meaning this is where you and your ability comes into play. It's really your choice on how you capture your subject. I'll just use this picture as an example. So my focal point was this car, nothing fancy. You have the road that's leading onto my subject, which is a great way to isolate your subject, and then you have a puddle. So this kind of also goes back to filling the frame, taking advantage of that foreground, and then lowering my camera enough to get that reflection of the car. So shooting from the ground is a great way that I like to use perspective, and from experience I've learned that it can be useful in some situations. But then again, you gotta go out and shoot, and you gotta practice for yourself. And yeah, you've probably heard it on about every video on the planet, but you're not gonna see progression unless you actually go out and practice. So practice, practice, practice. Quick summary of the video for exposure. Settings like shutter priority and aperture priority. Take advantage of those settings because they're really going to get you into the swing of things when it comes on to like shooting manual and having to manually adjust your settings for the correct exposure. Filling the frame, using the grid is a great way to make sure that the certain points in your shot are evenly balanced. You're not leaving too much foreground, you're not leaving too much background. And lastly, perspective. Play around with it, play around with different perspectives, play around with different angles. Yeah, so that is Street Photography Simplified. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this helpful if you were kind of going through the same things that I was going through. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Make sure to leave me a like if you did learn something, and possibly subscribe. It is free. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.